Hey guys, Coach Matheu here with another video on our Play Like a World Champion series. And today we're talking about the person who takes the title from Alekhine, and that's Max Euwe. So from the Netherlands, Euwe defeats Alekhine narrowly in a match. I think it was by one extra win in 1935, and he's actually able to keep the title for 2 years. And I regard Euwe as sort of one of the, I guess, overlooked world champions, if you can even say that about world champions, or one of the forgotten world champions. Partly because of how he got the title and then how he loses the title. But I mean, going through his games, there's no question to me he's a great. He had a way of just sort of managing the game until it was time, for tactics or a combination. Yeah, I don't think he was as sort of dominant as a player in sort of the middle game or the opening as Alekhine was. But that shouldn't like detract from his legacy for sure. I mean, he beat him, so that has to mean something. Um, so anyway, Irv was able to get the title from Alekhine because Alekhine chooses to play Irva. And I mean, this isn't so different from the other world champions. I mean, they also chose to play the people who beat them, but it's more that Alekhine chose to play Irva instead of others. So Alekhine takes the title from Capablanca. We may have seen this in an earlier video. After he takes the title from Capablanca, he completely avoids him. Completely avoids him. I think they only play like one time after that. So Alekhine says, you know what? I'm not giving this guy a rematch. Nope, there's no way he's taking the title from me. So instead of playing someone who may beat him, he chooses to play Irva. And that's kind of disrespect. It's like, no, I'll play that guy. I'm sure they're going to keep my title. But he loses. And this actually comes up later in the world champion cycle where the world champion picks his opponent and loses. So, guys, when you become world champion, if for some reason you get to pick your opponent, don't. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter even if it's your mom. Do not pick your opponent. You're going to lose. History is not on your side with that decision. So that's how Irva becomes the champion. He beats Alekhine after Alekhine says, "Here, yeah, I want to play that guy." So here I wanted to show a game just to, put some respect back on Irva's name as the champ. So he's playing white against Mitchell in 1934 Hastings. This is a year before he becomes world champ. Let's jump in. So Irva's playing white, knight f3. Flexible move, just seeing what's your opponent going to do. The game can still go in several different directions. It can be in English, it can be a Sicilian, it can be a Queen's Gambit, it can be a King's Indian. So d5, d4, we're in a queen pawn game. Knight f6, both sides staying flexible. Now white has to make some decision on which line they're going to play. Are they going to go e3, bishop f4, bishop g5, g3, knight c3. So here's c4. I guess none of those options I said. We're headed for Queen's Gambit. This is more in the Queen's Gambit decline territory so far, meaning just black hasn't taken the pawn yet. Knight c3. The pawn isn't completely free, by the way. I mean, Queen a4 would get the pawn back, but also a move like e3 or e4, and that pawn's in some trouble. Remember, the d pawn is a center pawn, the c pawn is not, so white isn't completely disappointed if they're allowed to put two pawns in the center at the cost of a pawn. So knight c3, c6, bishop g5. This is a useful move to play before you play e3 so that the bishop's not locked in the pawn chain. I mean, it is playable to put the pawn here before the bishop comes out, but then you shouldn't take on d5. A rule I was given coming up is if you plan on taking on d5, the bishop has no business being locked in the pawn chain. It's just senseless. I mean, actually, I get that now. So c6, bishop g5, knight bd7, e3. Bishop's outside the pawn chain. E pawn's here. The rook can use the c file. Should we take? Queen a5. This is a little bit of a tricky line. The queen steps out of the pin, sort of questioning the bishop, like, well, what are you doing here? And in some cases, this pawn can capture the c pawn, and the bishop may be hanging. There's also just this annoying pin to figure out how to deal with. So here, Euwe plays c takes d5. I'm just trying to break the possibility of black getting a chance to take and the bishop being vulnerable. So c takes. And here, black does knight takes. I'm not crazy about this move at all. If you remember, the whole point of playing stuff like, e6 and c6, sort of making this beachhead with the d5 pawn, is to make sure that black can maintain central control after they take, after white takes on d5, should white take on d5. But once you play a move like knight takes, well, you don't have that same center control. Your knight is in the center, but I can kick it out with a pawn eventually. Also, you have two pawns attacking the center, but they're not in the center. And you're going to have a very difficult time stopping stopping white when they play a move like e4. Like, how are you going to, fight for the center? And if you can't fight for the center, or at least attack the center, you're going to struggle in the middle game. So knight takes d5. I mean, it keeps the tension open with the bishop on g5, but long term, I don't think this is a good idea. So queen d2. The knight is not pinned anymore. I spoke too soon. Now the knight is pinned again. Bishop b4. Rook c1, making sure that these 1, 2, 3 attackers are met by 1, 2, 3 defenders. c5. It seems like black is putting pressure on white's center, or even just white's position. Black's been able to make threats these last few moves, but they aren't really causing white problems. So after e4, two pawns in the center. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, hitting the bishop. Bishop a3 hitting the rook. The rook goes to b1. This is actually a great square for the rook. I mean, all the space. The bishop's going to have a hard time moving off of c8 with the b7 pawn hanging. Rook b5 can happen at some point. The bishop can even go to b5. So the rook's very happy on b1. Castle. So here we see white has a sort of a Grunfeld-like center. Or these even come from like semi-terrace positions where also black captures with the knight on d5 after white does. And so white gets a nice center. White hopes to make use of that by pushing d5. And really, white wants to do two things. Either attack or promote this pawn, or both. And black really needs to try to defend it, make sure that d5 doesn't happen, or that white sort of just falls apart if they do get d5, like the c3 pawn becomes a problem. So it's not easy to play. I mean, I've had this position as white. Not that I'm like the expert on it, but it wasn't so easy to play even knowing the plans here. So let's see how the world champion handles it. Bishop d3, developing the bishop. a6, castle, b5. Okay, sort of trying to limit the rook's influence on the b file. The bishop can come to b7, keeping pieces out of c4. And here, Euwe just goes for it. d5. Really like this, sticking with the plan. The bishop, not so great on b7 with the pawn on d5. Also making sure, this is important, because let's say you played a move like e5, you don't want a blockade set up on d5, where a piece can use that square. So, d5. Knight b6, knight b6. Just pressuring the pawn. Of course, black would love it if white broke the tension here, but I mean, you can just feel the difference here. The board is opening up. I mean, these bishops could do some damage here. The c4 square looks very nice. The c3 pawn could become a target. You don't want to help your opponent develop pieces. You always have to be suspicious if you're playing a move and it lets your opponent's rooks connect, or their bishop develop. No. Nope, don't do it. Don't do it. Please don't do it. Sorry. So knight b6, bishop e7. Hitting the rook. Rook goes to e8. d6. Beautiful maneuver. by Euwe, I would say. So the pawn marching down the board, very close to promoting. Someone has to keep an eye on this pawn. It's 2 squares away from promoting, and the bishop is covering the queening square. It's not like the d5 square has been given to black anyway because of this nice pawn on e4. And the bishop is anchored by the king here, making sure that this king doesn't have the f8 square. So there's some mating nets here. There are some mating nets here, and the rook's just dominated. I mean, the rook can't go anywhere, partly because of this bishop on e6. So this goes back to something I say often. A piece on the back rank hurts more than just that piece on the back rank. Here we're seeing that this rook limited by the bishop and its own pieces. So let's see. c4. It attacks the bishop for sure. The bishop has to go back. It goes back to c2, staying on this diagonal, defending the e4 pawn. But it also just hands over a key center square to white, the d4 square. Now knight goes to d7. So black's retreating. The knight may go to f8, may go to f6. The queen can sort of come back, enter the game, maybe through b6. But the knight's not great here. I mean, definitely not happy. He's doing a blockading job. And you're just going backwards. Like I said, you have to be very careful when you go backwards. And as always, when your opponent goes backwards, you may want to look at going forward. So e5. Taking space. Now this bishop's open. This knight is not going into f6. I mean, just look at these monster pawns here. They're firmly entrenched on on black side of the board. Very strong. And just controlling squares. This is great. e5. So yeah, like I said, the knight's not coming into f6. Yes, the bishop has an open diagonal on b7, but this could be dangerous. Bishop takes h7, king takes, knight g5, you know. Let's say king g8, I may just go queen f4. And that's not fun to defend. You know, like let's say you play rook f8, queen h4 is still mate. And that hurts, you know, when you give your opponent material and they're like, no, I'm still going to checkmate you. So that's pretty strong. And these are the things you look for, by the way, when there's no knight on f6 and there's really just no defense for the king. If the king's the only one defending a square, that might be a square you want to go for. So instead of bishop b7, h6, which makes sure that pieces aren't jumping into g5, but h6 becomes a target, as we'll see. So rook fe1. This rook's preparing to enter the attack. And after bishop b7, knight goes to d4. So not letting the bishop take that knight, ruin the pawns. Maybe that still would have been fine, though. But also allowing this rook to swing over. So bishop c5, rook e3. And I just love what Euwe's doing here. I mean, black has no targets. Black's not making, you know, any real threats with all the pieces. You attack a pawn here, but all the pieces aren't really attacking anything. So that means black's tied down. Go for an attack. The pieces can't get to the other side to defend. They can't even counterattack. Go for an attack. Put pressure on the opponent. And you don't have to rush. He's slowly bringing his pieces up. So this rook's going to swing across. I love rook lifts. Putting the rooks in front of the pawns, not waiting for the pawns to get out of the way. And let's start attacking. So rook e3. That rook swinging over. Knight f8. Rook g3. Already we have, look, rook on the same file as the king. Queen takes h6 is not nice. Bishop takes d4. And Euwe wasn't even in the mood to take the bishop back. He plays a very strong forcing move here. Beautiful move. He just completely, you know, demolishes the king side. It's only defended. I tell my students, if a king is only defended by pawns, look to open that king up. If you have to sacrifice piece to get rid of those pawns. So rook takes g7. You don't really have a choice. If you don't take, check and mate after knight h7, queen takes. So he takes. And now bishop f6, this monster pawn defending the bishop here. And when king goes to g8, queen takes h6 is game. Good luck stopping checkmate on g7. If you can stop checkmate on g7, you should be the world champion. You can, you know, delay it, but that's not stopping it. So if you take, I don't even have to take this one. I can go here, and the next check you give will be here, and now I'll take this one. And good luck finding another check. This is game over. So this is Max Euwe. We see his greatness. He was able to maneuver and then, you know, build up a positional advantage and go checkmate his opponent. But who takes his title? Until then,